First of all, my apologies to everyone for having to change things. I ended up with a head cold that, of all things, was giving me like balance issues and like really mild vertigo and severe brain fog. So I reached out to Krista and I was like, I think I need to cancel. She's like, yeah. Yes, I'm sorry I had to reschedule. Thank you everyone for joining today. Why don't you go ahead? I would love for you to introduce yourselves over in the chat so I can get a really good sense. I think I know some folks, but I don't know everyone. But I'd love to know like who you are, where you're at, what role you're in, so that I can hopefully help you make some good connections to your role. So before we get started here, yeah, I'm at University of New Mexico as an assistant professor. But prior to that, I've spent over 20 years in various roles as an instructional designer, director of instructional design, senior instructional designer for a National Center on Low Incidence Disabilities. So I've been in all different kinds of applied roles. And I'm happy doing research and writing now, but I'm also really happy when I've got some sort of development project and I can kind of get into it up to my elbows, so to speak. So great. And hi, Danielle. Good to see you again as well. Sure, no problem, Meg. So, okay. So I'm going to launch into things here. We have a book that just came out on ethics and ed tech, reflection, interrogation, and design as a framework for practice. So what I'm going to do today is really talk through these core ideas of reflection, interrogation, and design. And like I said, we're going to have some different types of activities throughout. So I'll have some individual reflection time. We'll have a little bit of group work time. And then we'll have like a brainstorming on a Jamboard towards the end of stuff. And please, at any point, I've got the chat window like right next to my slides. Absolutely feel free to post questions, things like that. Christina, feel free to flag me, if you see a question go by that you're thinking, oh, that would be great. I really don't mind pausing and I don't mind interruptions at all. And I hope we have some great conversation as we go here. So, little story. I got an invitation to do a chapter on ethics, and the editors for that wanted me, they proposed a title for it called Rules Applied to Practice. And I replied saying, I'll write a chapter for you, but that's not how I'm going to frame this. I don't think that talking about ethics as codes or rules is really the best way to go about this. So I'm not going to be taking a codes or rules sort of approach. Part of this also stems from when I was at the University of Virginia, I taught in the Science, Technology, and Society department out there. And I absolutely loved how they approached ethics. They did not talk about like codes of ethics or things like that. We approached it all through a design lens, did a lot of failure analysis. Like we had a whole simulation around Hurricane Katrina and what happened with the levee system and how different processes and different design and development decisions could be made differently as a result of that failure analysis, et cetera. So I'm watching all this go by. This is so great. Awesome. Awesome, Virginia. So I'm not going to take a codes and rules sort of approach. There's a wonderful book that just came out in 2021 by Gerzenzweig called The Goods of Design. I love that title. Now, this is more written around like design generally. So he's kind of writing more towards designers and, not just instructional designers or ed tech. But he gets into this discussion about how codes of ethics and codes of conduct are documents that lay down guidelines for recommended, required, or forbidden behavior, but they're not the same as professional ethics. And I love how he kind of slices through the differences between codes of conduct or codes of ethics and professional ethics. So one of the key points here is that codes are normative. Now, if you're in an organization and you're trying to create a particular culture and determine, what behaviors are okay or not okay, the codes of ethics and codes of conduct, of course, make sense as a tool for that, sort of, but they are highly normative. That's not a really great approach for professional ethics. He calls professional ethics a larger rational endeavor, larger than codes of ethics, that is open to substantiated disagreements emanating from the multiple perspectives that may participate in the discipline. So I love how he is reframing professional ethics, first of all, as a place where we can be coming from multiple perspectives and we can have substantiated disagreements. We can see things differently, or as I like to put it, there's disagreements. And sometimes there's just simply seeing different parts of the elephant, and that's okay as well. And that's even productive. So some folks are really primed to see certain aspects of this elephant. Others are primed to see other aspects of this elephant. I did tons of work starting about in '99 around accessibility. I am constantly primed to see accessibility and usually talk about accessibility and identify that in the work that I do. Others really are more primed to come at things from like an equity or justice sort of perspective, or they've really focused on an ethics of care or something like that. Personally, I also tend to have a pretty strong sense of duty, of professional responsibility as part of my perspective too. So we have all of these different perspectives, and that's okay. And that can lead to some disagreements, but it can also lead to us basically seeing different parts of the elephant. So yeah. Also, from a research perspective, there's actually just a persistent disconnect between codes and practice. In fact, there's some really fascinating studies out there. Some of these, like Boatwright and McNamara, professional codes of conduct and codes of ethic often fail to impact practice. One of those studies, they literally presented the codes of ethics for computer scientists to a group of folks and then studied how they applied those codes right after being presented those codes of ethics. And there was no translation from the codes to practice. And we see this time and time again. Again, they tend to be more like behavioral, normative sets of statements. And professionals really have to do a lot of work to figure out how to translate that into practice. I went through and I did an analysis of instructional design and ed tech models in the field. I don't know how many of you come from like a formal background in ed tech or instructional design, but we have models. We're obsessed with models. We're obsessed with representations of design and process. None of those models incorporate ethics or anything that you could even tag as an ethical consideration in any way. So it's not even represented in our models of processes or practice. There are a few of those that make mention of accessibility because, of course, that became a hot legal topic for a while, but their treatment on accessibility is actually a little embarrassing. For example, one of them says, if you have learners who have disabilities, then they probably should not participate, and you should instead engage the support of somebody in special ed with that expertise. So it's very much this exclusionary, like not our problem sort of approach. So we definitely have an issue with the way in which we have framed ethics out of our representations of design practices and processes. I think other design and technology disciplines actually offer some great examples of more applied, practical integration of ethics, like engineering. The STS program that I was in was situated in a school of engineering. For engineering students, like you got to connect it to practice. There's also some fantastic work in human-computer interactions taking place. Colin Gray actually just shared out an amazing resource on LinkedIn, and I'll provide the link to that later on. I think we can actually draw more from how some of these other disciplines are approaching that. So in short, what I really want to do, what we tried to do in the book, was reframe ethics from statements or rules into key practices that can help us better connect ethics and practice. So reframing ethics for EdTech and instructional design. We've centered on 3 key ideas that just came up continually as we reviewed literature, et cetera, et cetera. First is professional ethics as reflective practice. The second is this idea of, actually, I'm going to go to interrogation. Professional ethics as interrogation. I see so much more of this. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. In fact, I'm going to kind of slice through this at a different angle. But this is where I commonly see a lot of like the critical analysis, critical questioning of technology and whatnot. So we have a more robust community around this. But I really also want to draw on this idea of professional ethics as design. So let's start with some of that reframing. I'm going to ask you to literally rethink ethics, and in so doing, invoke some key practices of reflection, interrogation, and design, and maybe even recast what some of those mean to you. Okay, so I'm going to break some PowerPoint rules here and put up a long quote. I've chunked it into pieces. One of the reasons I'm pulling up this quote, though, is because it was reprinted in 1996, but the original is from late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in there. But I'm going to just post this and let you kind of read through this. I'll post it in chunks. So first of all, I really like, I like this idea of its insistence on defensible choices. I think we all know that there are a lot of indefensible choices around technology right now. Thank you, Christina. So this is a quote from Davies. There's a book called Classic Writings in Instructional Technology. It was edited by Ely and Plant and published in 96, where they asked folks to recommend what were the pieces that everybody was reading. And really, as the field of instructional design, technology, ed tech, whatever you call it, was taking shape, there were all of these wonderful, rich debates exactly like this. And Davies really tends to embody this sort of discussion. And we lost all of that. I mean, I think this last part where he talks about the deep satisfaction and feeling of accomplishment that can be expressed in the doing of ed tech is often preferred to the pleasures of contemplating it. There was a lot of doing. There's still a lot of doing. People love to build stuff, right? They get enamored with the latest technology. Those of us who have been doing this quite a while, we've been through several cycles. Like you watch the AI hype right now, and it's like, oh yeah, we've been here before with virtual reality or MOOCs or Second Life or online learning or blah, 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 television, radio, we can go back. Yeah, exactly. So I love that Davies and really others in that collection, if you go back and read those classics readings, many of the early folks who were forming the field and starting programs and things like that were actually very concerned with the ethics of it and making sure that we engaged in the contemplation or the reflection on what we're doing, as well as the actual doing of that these go hand in hand. In fact, I think it was Finn, who I cite somewhere later in here, who said, look, in order to truly be a profession, ethics has to be a part of that. Otherwise, these aren't really professional activities. Hi, Maha. So I'm going to posit to you, professional ethics as reflection. What does that mean? So Pauline Shanks-Corrend, who is a PhD in philosophy, she's a philosopher who works no less at the Naval War College. I don't know if anybody knows what the war colleges are. I'm sure that sounds like a oxymoron to folks. But she is an ethicist who works at one of the war colleges. She defines ethics as a process of reflection, critical questioning, justification, argumentation, and application of morals, beliefs, values, etc. This emphasis on process, I think, is a really key distinction. I think a lot of folks tend to think of ethics as the morals, beliefs, values themselves. And Pauline talks about how no, that's not what ethics are. Ethics is a process of reflecting on and questioning those and figuring out how to apply those, and also developing your skills around justification and argumentation of what approach you're going to take and why you're going to take that approach. So I love this idea of ethics as a process of reflection and critical questioning. This ties nicely to for our field and for design generally, to Shern's idea of the reflective practitioner as someone who continuously incorporates lessons learned from past decisions to improve future outcomes and processes. So I think coming back to this idea of what does it mean to be a reflective practitioner, and how do we fold our ethics as a process of reflection and critical questioning into that sort of reflective practitioner pose. And Tracy and Bakke have, Monica Tracy's up at Michigan and John Bakke's out in Virginia. They do a lot of studying of reflection in action, in particular for designers. And so they talk about reflection in action. I think this is the key idea here, where when a designer is presented with complex problem or situation, that designer shows a series of questioning, making a decision, reflecting on the consequences of that decision, and then making another move. When we talk about iteration, this is exactly it. But iteration isn't simply, getting data and making a change. It's actually a reflective process. It's this little in-process reflective loop that designers tend to engage in. Yeah, exactly. Virginia, I'm looking at your comment about this is why codes don't work. Exactly. Gerzenzweig makes a really interesting point about codes of ethics as well. There's another philosopher, John Ladd, who thinks that codes are just, he calls them a moral absurdity. That's quite the statement. And so his Ladd's reasoning for that is that, look, it robs individuals of their moral agency if you're basically determining for them what their codes, what their ethics are for them. Gerzenzweig is like, yeah, well, but most codes of ethics actually are still so vague, and they still require the professional to do a lot of interpretation and figure out how those are going to apply. So they don't necessarily take away somebody's agency, but they do unnecessarily bound that sort of reflective process that individuals should be engaging in. Exactly. It's that reflective loop, right? That helps them to think about, okay, what are we going to come up with? So, quick discussion. If we treat ethics as a process of reflection rather than statements, then how does that change how you think about ethics? And what are some of the implications that you might begin to imagine for how ethics can become embedded in practice? Feel free to pop in if you've got ideas or type them in there. We're going to take just a few minutes to pause and think about this. In which discussions, like discussions of codes?
Yeah, anytime we're talking about basically culture, how we do things, I worry that in a group where they don't properly understand equity, that marginalized voices that speak up with reasonable requests won't be listened to, even by leaders who themselves are from marginalized populations. There was a report that came out from the UN, I forget which part of the UN, but saying that 9 out of 10 people are misogynistic. Well, okay, I don't know what population they sampled, but it's been known for a long time that misogyny alone, out of all other forms of discrimination, is a societal problem. And so these societal problems still influence these discussions. So I wonder how to conduct these discussions in ways that are properly equitable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times in design projects, it often the designer plays a role in trying to facilitate exactly that, right? In trying to, and I think that's why it's so important that we as designers actually figure out how do we embed this in practice, because you're right that a lot of leaders are really not they're not primed, they're not trained to think about this either. In fact, I think the next piece that I would really like to do is to focus on how we do this for leadership, not just for designers. But there are some really good design cases, and I think what we need to start doing as a field around this question that you're raising is actually start to develop design cases where designers share how they navigated that sort of challenge in a given project, and share that out as a form of design knowledge. So right now, I'm really hot to trot around this idea of design cases as a form of sharing and building design knowledge, which is a very different type of knowledge from research, right? Where we can share with each other how we did that. And I'm thinking of some design cases in particular that are in the International Journal of Designs for Learning, where the designers talk about navigating conflicting viewpoints. I mean, it's not even as simple as how do you bring those marginalized voices in. Often you do have conflicting interests that are represented in a project. And it's not, design is a tool that we use to try to navigate that. And there's rarely perfect solutions for that. But I think there are some design tools that we can use to improve around what you're talking about. And so that's a little bit of what I'm going to get into later when we talk about ethics as design. Like, what are some of those design tools we can actually use to address that? But also, I think we need to be sharing that kind of knowledge and building a sort of knowledge and strategy repository as a community for, how are folks navigating those in a given project, and what was the end result of different choices that they made with that. Let's see, I saw, yeah, Maha, in terms of something we do in perpetuity, I think that's exactly it. Like, this isn't something where you say, these are my ethics, I'm done, I don't have to think about this anymore. And, you sort of treat it as a checklist. I used to joke that you can't get to the end of your workday at work and be like, oh, I got 15 minutes left, I gotta gotta do my ethics. That's just right. That's not how it's going to work. They really are deeply embedded, and they're extremely process oriented, and so it is something that we engage with on an ongoing basis. Yes, it does depend on who's in the room, right? And that's where it's like, so what perspectives are we bringing in, and how are we trying to help elicit those as the designer in the project, both for our own ethical perspectives, as well as what tools are we using to try to draw that out from others. These are great ideas. More iterative and dynamic. I agree, Christina. Yeah. Right. So differences between, and this is where we often see conflicts. I mean, I certainly have been in situations where a job has demanded something of me that I just simply was not, willing to do. Now, rarely are situations that absolute. And I've been fortunate enough to have some of those situations throughout my own career where I've said, I'm not okay with this, I'm going to move to a different opportunity. Not everybody has that privilege, right, or that opportunity. And so these are some of those complex spaces that we often end up having to negotiate as designers. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving on here. You guys are welcome to keep posting things. So reflection becomes a process of reflecting on your own ethical perspectives as well. Like, do you approach it from a position of care or duty or principles or virtues, which right now principles and virtues tend to really be dominating our primary conversation around ethics. So I want you to take, this is just a personal reflection time. So I want you to take just 10 minutes. You may already know this. Let me get this link. Trying to find my
Just
slides.
posted it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you,
Yeah.
Christina.
And so did Rissa.
Yes,
I'm
thank
losing my
you.
voice, sorry.
So rather than recreating the wheel, yeah, isn't this a great primer? This organization, which I think is really, it's not even about education. They put together this fantastic primer. It's very long, but pages 19 through 23 in particular are wonderful summaries of different ethical perspectives that I find that even students who are like, I don't like all this philosophy stuff, find it very approachable. So what I want you to do is just take a moment to review pages 19 through 23 in particular, those summaries. Certainly feel free to peruse the rest of the primer. You do not have to pick a lane on these. Again, it's not like, shopping at a grocery store and saying, I'd like the blackberry jam instead of the plum jam. You may find that you employ a mix of these, or that you even emphasize one over another depending on project or context or something like that. So I just want you to take about 10 minutes, read through that, and think to yourself, I'm not even going to have you share this out unless you really want to come back and do that. What perspectives resonate with you? How can or does your ethical perspective begin to inform your work as a professional practitioner? For example, how would that ethical perspective inform front-end analysis, or technology evaluation and selection, or strategy selection, or creation or selection of materials, or even how you evaluate a project or a product? So take 10 minutes. I'm going to have everybody turn their videos off and your audio off, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes. So hopefully this is just a little bit of quiet time in your day.
Sorry, Stephanie, I was having trouble finding the download link because overview page.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Can have it. So I
Thank you.
think the one I just posted, if you go down to complete lesson plans, it says download the entire primer. Might be the right one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Ah, yes. Yes, thank you. I don't know, they keep changing how they post it, but that's perfect. Thank you, Christina. All right, I'm going to mute myself now. Folks, I'm going to do a quick just verbal overview of some key ideas from this. If you want to mute me so you can truly hear your own thoughts, please do so. And then we'll be coming back together in about 5 minutes. So very quick summary here of some of the different ethical perspectives. One of the first ones, a very common one you hear about, is moral rules or duty. You might hear this as ethics duty, or the more fancy term would be deontological. So this tends to focus more on the nature of an act itself and not what happens as a result of that. It's really more focused on how one behaves, and some of it may be normative, like one should act only in ways that be acceptable if everyone else acted that way, or the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. This really stems from Kant. This tends to offer a perspective of like consistent principles or rules. It treats persons as ends and into themselves, and never only as a means to an end, and really tends to place an emphasis on individual rights. Of course, there are some downsides to it, where it doesn't really tend to offer ways to deal with conflicting obligations. Perfect duties permit no exceptions, which can make it more morally difficult to reconcile. Of course, we don't really, there don't tend to be situations of perfect duties. And it doesn't really offer a lot of guidance about forming and applying moral rules in real life settings as well. At the same time, this may be something that appeals to folks because, like I said, I tend to have a pretty strong sense of, I have a sense of duty or responsibility to learners or individuals who are impacted by the systems that I build or work on or whatever. And so, you may still have an aspect of this that really appeals to you. Then, of course, we have virtues, which focuses more on the character of the person. So this might focus on like the designer's integrity or trustworthiness. In fact, there's a whole strain in design ethics around designers as guarantors, that if I design and build something, am I acting as a guarantor and saying that I affirm that I have designed something that should actually work and that should have a positive impact, that I'm actually willing to stake my name or reputation on that. All of that really ties back to that designer's character. How trustworthy is a designer or builder? How integrous are they and how they approach things? So, some folks put more emphasis on character development and how you carry forward that sense of character in the work that you do. Then there are outcomes or consequentialist. I have a little bit of this trait in me too. The focus here is on the consequences of the actions, or what is the impact that if you are maximizing the amount of whatever outcome is deemed good, then that has some sort of intrinsic value or usefulness, or is desirable. Tends to be utilitarian as a strain of this. It's not the only form of this, but it is a major strain of consequentialism or focus on outcomes, greatest good for the greatest number of people. Tries to consider all persons equally, directs attention to the consequences of actions, not just the act itself or the individual's character. Offers a familiar form of reasoning. But under this, bad acts with good consequences might be permissible. You can probably generate examples of that fairly quickly. It also doesn't pay a lot of attention to relationships or the highly personal nature of a sense of duty or care in the work that we do. And certainly here, the interests of a majority can easily override the interests of minorities, which Danielle has already raised as a significant concern. Then we have, my scroll bar is not cooperating. Principles. This is one we hear a lot about. Of course, it's saying, okay, I'm oriented around justice or equity or diversity. Through this, somebody is identifying a principle or a set of principles that they believe are really core. That's what they center as their approach. So this can draw on a number of different principles. Sometimes those principles may not necessarily be ones that you might agree are great principles. For example, I would classify white supremacy as a principle. In which case I would definitely, that's where I think like duty, care, consequentialism become really, really important. So, and then we have ethics of care. Yeah. This has also received a lot of attention lately. It tends to focus on relationships and power, understanding structures of underlying situations. Of course, when we talk about systems of care or systems of oppression, that's often coming from this sort of care perspective. It tends to really try to highlight who are vulnerable populations, what's the importance of experience, what do people bring? And then what's the underlying structure of a situation and how can we dissect that or better understand that? What or who, I would add, is being ignored, and then who benefits at whose expense, who's left out. All of this really represents a sort of care disposition in one's work. So this definitely can provide a balance to the principle-based approach. Like I was just saying, principles-based approach has some benefits, but there also are points at which it really breaks down. Some of the challenges here are that, of course, power structures are not always evident. It's really easy, even for the person who is most intentional about this, to not see all of those elements, no matter how much you do personally care and are trying to enact that care. And it also can lack some rules or principles that are easier to apply in practice. So the page after that provides a nice kind of breakdown and comparison across all of these. I'm not going to get into that. I think it is, let me get back to my Zoom window and bring everybody back. It's my Zoom window. All right, sorry, Rissa, I've lost it. I have to stop share. Okay, you're welcome to come back in now. And apologies, I hope you didn't mind, but I was actually trying to provide a layer of accessibility there for the PDF document. So hopefully I wasn't too distracting for those of you who really wanted to focus as well. That is a really great example of design tensions, by the way. So let me get back to sharing my screen now that I can see everybody. Let me get my chat back up. Perfect. Okay. Well, before we move on, does anybody have anything that they wish to share from that personal reflection? Again, you do not have to. I intended that to be truly personal.
I actually have, and you might be addressing this later, but I know for me personally, the last one, the care, I think, because it's very close to, as I put in the chat, the frameworks that are used for cross-cultural immersion, and the fact that you're going into other countries where there are different values. And so what we were taught, I was an exchange student years and years ago, and what we were taught was it's okay to have your own personal values and to but to recognize that there are other people who have different values. So recognizing that was really important, and to accept and respect those values and work within that. And that's what I felt that the care one sort of addresses. But the one thing that I think often comes up is you're talking about power structures, and I've been in this situation in business where I did not have power. I had my own ethics, and I was asked to do things that I felt were unethical. So in the end, what I did was left the
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, that's one of those things, I was able to leave the situation, but people, and my students included, often will say, well, I can't afford to.
Right.
And so we've discussed it like, okay, so start looking for another job and know that this is something. But I feel that that's something that's not often addressed is when you have that, when you don't have the power, you know where the power is, and there's very little that you can do.
Right.
How do you work within that, I guess?
Right. And I have one of my colleagues here at UNM studies design. And one of the things that she studies is agency and design, which, she does that through a sort of a rhetorical sort of analysis where you can see that showing up in the words that designers use. Like, they may be hedging using words like may or could or things like that. Or they'll make explicit reference to either a lack of agency or a sense of agency. So ethics in part really are about agency and what agency someone senses. In fact, wonderful, thanks, Maha. In fact, there's kind of this whole line of research where it treated ethics as more of a cognitive construct, that if you just taught it to students, that they would just magically go out and apply it into a workplace setting. And then, of course, people didn't. And, they were like, what does this mean? Were they not really, not really morally mature, things like that. And I think all of that ignores exactly what you're raising. I would kind of frame that as like performance improvement or organizational context, that you start to run into clashes between an individual's understanding. And this happens all the time, not just with ethics, right? But even with like professional methods and practices that we learn. Here's a way to do it to make it effective. But then you get out into the job and your boss is like, yeah, we don't have time for that. Or something like that. And so you're always having to try to figure out how to navigate those sorts of trade-offs. And so designers take, or really practitioners take a range of different approaches. And like I shared, for me personally, I've had different situations where in some, I've done, like you said, I tend to be a bit of a willful individual too. So I know that if it's conflicting too much, it's just not going to work. I'm not going to be able to stay there. I've got to find or make a change. That's not always how somebody else is going to approach that. And so we end up more engaging in this process of figuring out, okay, if there's a major conflict here, how am I going to navigate that? I think rather than having some sort of neat, clear answer to the question that you're raising, part of what we should be doing is raising these questions with our students and actually walking them through a process of reflecting on and thinking for themselves, how are they going to navigate those sorts of situations so that they're better prepared for that on the job. And they've sort of thought through for themselves as well, what is my individual path or choice here. So I don't think that there's a clean answer, because that answer is really going to be different for individuals. But I feel like what my sense of responsibility is with students is to make sure that I'm prompting them to think about that, giving them some time to reflect on that, and even start to develop a schema for how they will navigate and manage those sorts of situations. Yes, exactly. I love your point that often people have more agency than they realize. So then we get into what are ways in which designers can actually embed their ethics as part of their general practice. And there's really a lot of ways that designers not only can, but do this. In fact, in a lot of ways, if you think about our discourse on technology, that it's not value free, it's not neutral. There are some folks who make the argument that we are embedding our interests, our values, our beliefs into the work that we do. And really what we need to do is just be more cognizant of that work. So I think that there are a lot of places where folks are enacting agency more. For example, I mean, I've been in roles where I've really had to advocate for accessibility. Sometimes that's been really straightforward, and folks have been like, yep, I get it. Other times I've worked with vendors who are like, we don't care about that. We're not going to address it. So we've had very difficult, hot meetings with vendors about what are we going to do? How are we going to do that? I've also dealt with one institution that just simply didn't really prioritize accessibility or universal design. And I would say that was about an 8 to 9 year long path to try to effect change in that space, which we eventually did, but that was a really long path. I don't know how many people are that patient with a change effort. So, okay, so let me kind of continue on here. So under this idea of ethics as reflection, ethics become a specific form of reflection in action. So Stern kind of breaks it down into reflection in action and reflection on action. I think a lot of times folks think more about reflection on action, like after the fact, I've done something and I'm going to reflect on it. Well, like I was sharing from Tracy and Baki, designers actually really exhibit this sort of idea of reflection in action. They do something, tinker with it, try it out, lessons learned, go back, iterate on it. So this form of reflection and action is where we ask particular types of questions and reflect on those decisions during different design phases or design activities. So rather than waiting to the end and only having a reflection after action loop, how can we bake this into reflection in action? We as designers, we already do that on other aspects of a project or a product that we're developing or things like that. So ethics can become another layer to that sort of questioning. So I'm going to give you an example. I just love this work. Ingram and Boyd gave a presentation. This is a team that worked together designing virtual worlds and simulations for training. What they did, they described this, and this is kind of me analyzing what they were talking about and breaking it down. But first of all, they articulated a central question to reflect on their design process and products. Their main question was, how do we support social justice for learners? That was the primary thing that they were really interested in. One tool that they used is what we call problem framing. It's what my colleague here, Vanessa Svila, spends a lot of time in. I love this idea of problem framing. They actively, like explicitly framed the problem that they were working on, not merely as a learning or a technical problem. In other words, we're not just designing virtual worlds or simulations with these learning objectives to meet these technical specs, but they also included racial disparity as part of their problem framing. In other words, they were essentially saying, we are working to address both learning and other needs or problems. So they selected 3 specific ethical concerns that they wanted to address in and through their design and development process: whitewashing or normalizing whiteness, racial stereotyping, and digital blackface. Around those, they developed explicit questions that they use to reflect on and question their process and products throughout their entire process of like brainstorming, idea generation, prototyping, production. At every stage, they would pause and intentionally ask themselves, does this include people of color? Do those characters include racial stereotypes? And who is performing that character? And of course, based on that, then they would iterate on and make changes to that. And even though this was a diverse team, you know, kind of going back to Danielle's question earlier, this was a diverse team. So it wasn't like they had just only white people on the team. You know, they really did have a diverse team. But by using these questions, they did catch instances where they didn't have enough representation. They did have some characters that reflected racial stereotypes. So they went in and either changed the race of that character or changed some of the framing or language or things like that so that it wasn't stereotypical. And then they also were very reflective about who they hired as voice actors to perform those characters as well. So I love how this is this idea of taking this really abstract, almost obtuse idea, right, of ethics as reflection and process, and saying, how do we drill this down into something that's very practical and pragmatic and very applied in the work that we're doing? And of course, you look at this and you can see there's all kinds of other things that they're not considering here, right? Like this doesn't get to accessibility or anything like that. But what they did say was, we're going to frame these particular considerations into the work that we're doing, and we're going to use these explicit reflective questions to prompt ourselves and remind ourselves throughout the process. I thought this was just such a fantastic example. And I loved how the designers themselves were also willing to share, you know, their own process of improvement and acknowledge that they didn't get this absolutely right, you know, right out of the bat, even with having a diverse team. You know, they really did use reflection and action as an iterative process to continually improve what they were doing. So that idea of reflection and action. Okay, I want you to, we're going to do this as a very quick activity. I think I want you to just take 5 minutes and then come back and share, actually. So choose a particular project you're working on now, or focus on your own personal design philosophy. Like you could slice this a number of ways. What I want you to do is articulate a central question that you can use to reflect throughout your design process. And I'll go back to the slide so you can see how Ingram and Boyd did all of this. I want you to select 2 or 3 specific ethical concerns. Again, you don't always need to try to eat the entire enchilada here. Just choose 2 or 3 specific ethical concerns that you want to address. How can you frame the project you're working on to include both learning and those priority ethical concerns that you want to address? Or if you're wanting to focus on your own personal design philosophy, how would you articulate your own personal design philosophy to incorporate a focus on, I mean, I assume we all want to impact learning, that's just sort of base, but how would you also incorporate those ethical concerns or priorities? And then develop some explicit questions. I think this is a key tool that we can use to have explicit questions, almost like a post-it note you might put on your monitor of, oh yeah, I want to remind myself, did I do X? Did I do Y? Did I do Z? So that you can use those as explicit reflective questions throughout your process. So take 5 minutes on your own. Again, I'm just going to turn off audio here for a little bit. I'll go back to the prior screen, and then we'll come back here in 5 minutes and share examples, or absolutely feel free to go ahead and post in the chat as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start bringing us back slowly. Feel free to keep writing ideas down, of course. And also feel free to share over in the chat window. What I would love to see examples of are explicit questions that you're developing. Like I said, like what's that? If you were going to put a post-it note or a little, sidebar on your whiteboard or something like that and say, these are some reflective questions where I really want to make these sort of a matter of habit to keep reminding myself to ask, what would those questions be? Oh, wonderful. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, Christina, I really like your questions. Like I mean, certainly, 5 minutes probably isn't enough time. And I can imagine these are questions that you will actually refine and polish over time. And you might even change some questions out. Like I said, I have questions around accessibility as part of my reminders and prompts all the time. So then a next step off of those questions could be a really good thought process on, okay, what are the tools I can use to try to identify everybody and get them engaged, and how can I bring that in? And when you say see themselves in it, what does that mean? And how would you know, right? How would you start to know? So how might you have a very participatory process? We do have tools like participatory design and emancipatory design that are design processes that are encourage or prompt us to do exactly this, right? Who are we engaging? How are we engaging them? Are folks actually participating? I see so much of like care and principles orientations coming out here. I love this. Yeah, right. I think, Rissa, I think you have just put your finger on something that we're going to have to contend with as instructors, as designers. People's capacity right now is lower. In fact, I was just thinking about this in relation to a colleague who's struggling with long COVID. I was reading a great piece about how we often define, especially in a capitalist society, worth is defined as productivity. And so I've really been thinking about what do I need to reframe in my own thinking to move away from productivity as a measure? Like it's so deeply embedded and inherent that I really have to actively unpack that so that I can think better about how do we support that colleague moving forward, especially if she's not able to be as productive as a result of long COVID, right? I think that capacity and burnout are really significant social issues that we've got to deal with right now. So I actually keep putting like mental health and burnout in some of my questions as well. These are fantastic. So I wanted to just kind of get you going on a path of where you're starting to think about, okay, rather than all this stuff kind of bumping around out here, what are some tools I can use? One of those tools I think are explicit reflective questions that you can begin to intentionally remind yourself to ask about your projects. So I wanted to share another example of ethics as reflection. It's kind of a lighter example, but it's a different tack to it. Mary Rice, who's also here at UNM, I just adore her too. She did a great paper. It was in Tech Trends on special education teachers' use of technologies during COVID-19. The teachers in her study, and sorry, that really should be reflection in action. The teachers talk about how they rethought their initial technology selections and uses. And I think this is a good type of reflection to encourage as well. So one teacher shared how she rethought her use of muting features in Zoom and changed that to give students more voice and power. She realized she was actually silencing her students. And she was like, because at first teachers were being told, force students to turn on video, mute it to control it, turn off the chat, blah, blah. And all the teachers talked about how they were like, I did that at first, but then, and there's that reflection process. Then I, changed or adapted how I went about this. Another one shared that she originally turned off the chat features, but then realized that erected barriers to students asking questions and creating community online. So all these things that people were frustrated with online, it's not interactive. I don't have a sense of community. It's not engaging. Well, a lot of that tied down to decisions that they were making around their choice of tools and their use of different features in those tools. So this teacher talked about adapting that tool to make it more open, more inclusive, more welcoming and inviting. Another shared how she learned that her choices of how to use some Zoom features created stress for a student with autism. The student was really beginning to act out. And so she changed both her policies and her tool choices to create more flexibility and more openness in the classroom, which helped to reduce that student's stress in the online environment. And that student then went on, and of course this benefited other students too, but then that student went on to do perfectly fine in the online environment. So what I love about these again is how these are examples of individuals who are saying, look, I didn't get it right out of the bat. My husband's actually a military strategist, and they have a saying that no design or no plan survives first contact. That's why reflection is so critical. So here's teachers who are like, all right, my initial plan did not survive first contact. And they're identifying in particular, ethical issues that arose during that. And they're saying, how can I adapt my uses? Notice they're not talking about like pitching Zoom or pitching online learning, but they're saying, how can I adapt this so that I can increase inclusivity, make this a much more open and welcoming environment? How can I reduce the student stress just by changing my policies and my tool choices? So this may not be some of the more heady ethical problems that we were discussing earlier, but I think these are representative of many of the little day-to-day ethical problems that come up in practice. So again, this idea that reflection leads to iteration and changes and improvements over time. All right, at this point, I'm gonna have us take a break and then we'll come back. I have a terrible sense of time. I told Christina this before I got going on things. So let's just take just a few minutes. You can go hit the bathroom, stretch, go outside, breathe in some fresh air, go pet your doggy or kitty, go grab a drink or whatever. I'll be right here. And let's come back in just like 2 or 3 minutes. I'll get going in about 3 minutes, okay? If you're still making your way back, that's fine. So I have to share as folks are coming back here. I put a cat in here because I've always had dogs, but our kids insisted on getting a cat. So we got him a cat as a Christmas present. And we have just absolutely, he's just the most fun ever. We've adored integrating him. And then last week we were in Oklahoma visiting family, and my sister and her family had found a kitten that had wandered into they have several acres out in Oklahoma. This kitten was just wandering around. So they'd taken her in, gotten her cared for, and they were fostering her. And my whole family, we all just took to the kitten. We were like, we think he'll get along too. So we now also have a little kitten. So I'm obsessed with cats now, in other words. Okay. All right, so coming back to we've talked about ethics as reflective practice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about professional ethics as interrogation. I'm actually not going to spend as much time here as you might think. In part because I think that we're really active. We have a lot of folks engaged in this. I really want to drill down to professional ethics as design. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics as interrogation. And like I said, I'm going to cut through this with in a different direction, kind of try to open up a different dimension here. So professional ethics as interrogation. I included this because Terry Green interviewed Heather and I about our book on his podcast, and he was like, I love this word, interrogation. It makes it sound like you're putting technology under the spotlight. And again, being married to a military strategist who is also a retired intelligence officer, I was like, I love this idea of like putting it under that spotlight and really interrogating it. So, of course, this is the idea of taking a critical approach to technology, interrogating educational technologies and asking critical questions of those, in part to unpack and evaluate underlying beliefs and philosophies towards technology. Again, the reason I'm going to kind of cut through this quickly is I feel like this is something that we're doing a lot more of and seeing a lot more of. When I first started working on ethics over 20 years ago, in fact, my advisor at the time told me not to do anything on ethics. He was like, it's not a valuable line of inquiry. People aren't going to see that as very important. You're not really going to have a great career based on this, blah, 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 all of that stuff. And indeed, for many, many years, I feel like we've sort of, as I've gone along, I've just felt like it has sort of felt like being a voice in the wilderness on this. And then things started to change. I think, we've got art, journals like Learning, Media, and Technology, and the work that Ben Williamson is doing to facilitate a lot of this dialogue. We've had, I've seen just an increased number of folks start to pick up like feminist theories and other critical approaches to technology and really do just all kinds of wonderful application of those. So this is an area where I think that we're actually doing a lot of. In some ways, if we go back to this model, I think we're kind of heavy on this aspect of it and maybe a little bit lighter in these areas. So I'm wanting to rebalance things a little bit. So as part of unpacking and evaluating those underlying beliefs and philosophies, this is where we do kind of have to get a little heady on things. But really, there are sort of three separate major paradigms at play. There's modernism, and this is what you really tend to see represented in a lot of ed tech as an industry, extremely modernist views of technology equals progress. Anything that we create is necessarily beneficial, all of these ideas. And then, of course, you've had the response to that through the postmodernist critiques of technology, of these presumptions. And then there's also this emerging paradigm that you may not be aware of called metamodernism. And that's where I'm going to spend my time. And of course, I'll explain why. So let me get into moving away from a postmodernist paradigm. I'm going to be a little, I don't know how much of a limb I'm going out on right now or not. My guess is as I work through all of this, you guys are going to be like, oh, yeah, actually, I get this, and I may be metamodernist too. So third option between unbridled optimism and unbridled pessimism. So first of all, let's just lay down some of the terrain here, right? They are. They're always challenging. So modernism was very much a positivist mindset, right? It's this very optimistic belief in technology and progress, progress is technological development. In fact, when I teach on ethics, I actually start my class with week 1. I have them read an article by Leo Marx, not Karl Marx, Leo Marx, that's called "Does Improved Technology Mean Progress?" And we talk about what are different ways in which we can define progress. That you can certainly define that in technological terms, but you can also define progress in social terms or other ways, in which case technological progress or technological improvements may not necessarily equal progress. Right? I think we all know that and get that. So there's this emphasis on rational thought, that science is this very rational and neutral endeavor. There's very much an emphasis on seeking truth and certainty, and it's very focused on construction, on building, on creating products and building buildings and things like that, right? Postmodernism, of course, was the critique of all of that, where knowledge, there is no single truth. Knowledge instead is constructed. We as individuals engage in meaning-making processes, and the meaning that we make of things can be very different. What we would consider our own truths can be very different from other people's truths. So reality becomes very multi-perspectival. In other words, of course, what is real, what is true, what constitutes knowledge. There are multiple perspectives of that, and those all have validity. Although there were some caveats to that. So my background is English theory, critical theory and all of that. There was this theory that came about that was called reader response theory. Stanley Fish, who originally posited that for every reader of a book, there is an interpretation of that book as well. And then I like to joke that he started teaching literature and discovered that some interpretations are, in fact, not really great interpretations. They're not anchored in the text, or something like that. So he sort of modified reader response theory to say, okay, there's not infinite possibilities, but there are multiple possibilities here. Truth, of course, is socially and culturally contextual and constructed. Science and all human activities are, in fact, value laden. And in fact, science itself is reflective of a certain set of values. Postmodernism, like art and things like that, tend to emphasize irony, doubt. There's this idea of pastiche. I could kind of go on and on. But it's also characterized by deconstruction, right? That analysis of saying what we're going to do is we're going to peel those layers back to reveal those systems of power, et cetera, et cetera. In between is this idea of meta-modernism, where it's the best way to think of meta-modernism is not as an alternative to modernism or postmodernism. There's a tendency to think of these things linearly because they develop chronologically. But really what metamodernism is a oscillation. That's Yusuf's word. It's an oscillation between modernism and postmodernism. And as I'm talking through some of those things, you can probably start to feel a little bit of that there are folks who said, okay, the critique of postmodernism absolutely makes sense, and it helps us unpack valuable insights, but it really kind of remains stuck at the point of critique, and we need to be able to move past that. So there's this, like I said, this oscillation between the two. I love this quote from Lecompte where she summarizes it as, yes, the planet is dying. Right. She's talking about climate change. Yes, all these things are going bad. We have terrible policies. We have, companies are polluting the environment, blah, 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 blah. Like the postmodernist critique is real, but the critique tends to not translate into action. So how do we translate that into action? In other words, she says, yes, the planet is dying. I get it. Things are not in a great shape right now, but maybe we can do something about it. So there's this focus instead on reconstruction And I could do something on just metamodernism if you guys really want me to do, like go into all kinds of depth on this at some point. But when we were putting our book together, I was talking with Heather about, I was like, I'm actually always really uncomfortable with postmodernism because it's about that it's about that deconstruction and taking things apart. It's that analysis. Where's the synthesis? As a designer, I couldn't find what my inclinations are within postmodernism. And there's some fundamental premises of postmodernism that I personally don't actually agree with. At the same time, I definitely agree with the critiques of modernism that are offered. But at the same time, like, design is optimistic. In fact, I'll get into that here in a little bit. So I tend to oscillate right between the optimism of design. I can take a problem, we can work on it. Yes, it's messy, but you know what? What's the alternative? Not rolling up my sleeves and doing something about it? That doesn't sound really interesting to me. So, I want to design, create, build something, or reconstruct. In fact, I've got a whole paper about how blended learning is this actual reconstructive act. It's lovely because what people are doing is saying, okay, things are fractured, and blended learning is sort of the tool that I think folks are landing on to say, how do we stitch these pieces together so that we make this work? And we try to bring those fragments back into some sort of cohesive whole. Yeah. So it's sort of reinvigorating these ideas of authenticity. Engagement is critical. Again, engaging in the problem solving, not just saying there's a problem, but engaging in the problem solving. And then it's also sort of reimagining ethics as well. So when Heather brought metamodernism to me, she was like, Steph, I think you're a metamodernist. And I started reading all of this. I was like, you're right. This really captures it for me much, much more. So as part of this, there's this lovely idea, you're going to learn a new vocabulary word today, of metaxis. So metaxis is a word from Plato, I think, and it means in-betweenness. It's that idea of oscillation between two ideas, that you've got these seemingly conflicting opposites, and what you're doing is navigating those. We do this all the time in instructional design and the work that we do. So you may be navigating space between one and many, unity and plurality, authenticity and pastiche. Like I said, we do this all the time as designers, where it's like, I want my learners to have a very consistent experience. And so how am I going to design in consistency? And yet I also want them to have their own unique experiences of building their knowledge. And I want to support faculty in designing really creative classes where it's not all cookie cutter. So how do you balance like consistency of design with novelty and creative ideas? So we're constantly actually in this sort of metaxis. So metamodernism isn't dismissive of postmodern ideas or critique, but it uses them for different outcomes. It also reimagines some modernist ideas such as authenticity, ethics, engagement, and aesthetics. And there's some really good readings on this. If you want, I can give you those references if you want to dig into this. But Yusuf, this is a great article in particular, summarizes metamodernism as a new enthusiasm for real essential issues. In other words, what we're doing is saying there's some real problems that we need to tackle. Metamodernism was very focused on grand narratives, right? There were these grand narratives that drove all of humanity, regardless of culture. Postmodernism was kind of like, no, culture matters, context matters. Now, however, there's this sort of, like I said, in between this, okay, yes, culture and context matter, but we have some shared problems that we need to work on, like climate change. Doesn't matter where you are, you may be impacted differently by this, but this is a shared, real, essential issue that we need to work on together. And we certainly have some of those shared, real, essential issues and problems that we need to work on in education and learning as well. So that metaxis and in-betweenness, metamodernism acknowledges those fractures, those splinters, that multi-perspective approach, and the needs and shortcomings and the inequities of learning technology. and also frames those fractures as real essential issues that require responses and actions, and not just critiques and analysis, or not just devolution into nihilism either, which is a tendency of postmodernism. So kind of coming back to, okay, we do have real essential issues. These are significant, authentic critiques. What can we do about it? So that engagement in solving real needs or problems becomes a crucial reconstructive strategy or a form of pragmatic idealism. So some examples of this. Again, I want to try and bring this down to like very tangible examples. Vanessa Scholes wrote a piece. It's in Educational Technology Research and Development, published in 2016. I think I cite this article like all the time. I talk about it nonstop. Yes, Daniela, I think you could also call this a very pragmatic approach. Again, it's a sobered approach, right? It's much more sober than modernism, but it's not purely just the critique. And we are a very applied field. So I think metamodernism fits for us. And I actually think a lot of folks who call themselves postmodernists are probably actually metamodernists, because they're not just involved in the critique, they're also trying to figure out, okay, what do I do based on that? Like critical pedagogy is a really good example of that. So, okay, so Scholes, she's exploring ethics of learning analytics for at-risk students. Let me go back here. There's a real tendency in ethics to say ethics is about judging or evaluating or determining right or wrong, good or bad, yes or no, on or off. Scholes is an example of how to kind of slice through all of that and take a very different approach. So again, back to this idea, she articulated it, yes, Rissa, so is ungrading. Are students individuals and treated as such? And are they agents in the learning process? So she developed this as like, here's the central question I'm going to ask of learning analytics and any implementation of it in a higher ed institution. So again, back to problem framing. If learners are individuals and are agents in their learning processes, then the implementation of learning analytics should afford individual assessment, informing the individual, and should afford agency for students throughout their learning. So here you can see how she has reframed learning analytics and the problem, what we call problem framing or problem setting, to incorporate a sense of the individual learner and a sense of agency for students. Using design to navigate tensions, rather than treating, usually learning analytics focus on group-based, right? It's all about aggregation, disaggregation into groups. Can we predict based on blah, blah. She said, rather than treating group-based analysis and individual-based analysis as competing constraints that force some sort of choice between the two, Scholes asks, how can we capture this value of individual agency whilst employing learning analytics? So she's trying to figure out, how do we use both group-based analysis and individual-based analysis together? So like I said, she doesn't use ethics to reach some sort of binary decision of good, bad, or adopt, reject. She's not saying, oh, there's all these potential downsides to learning analytics, therefore we should reject it. Instead, what she's doing is she's using ethics to map the problem space or terrain, and then devise or design solutions and options. And I want you to notice how she treats these as design specifications. So I'm going to walk through what she generated in this approach. So she mapped out what are potential benefits and what are potential harms, and what are ways in which we can optimize the benefits and minimize those harms. Again, there's no assumption of a perfect solution here. Design is actually not about perfection. It's about options and possibilities. So, and this is a lot. You can have my slides. I'm happy to share those, or just go read her article. But she talks about using factors of learning analytics assessment to include more focus on individual choices. So a program level example of this was that if a student who completes online study timetable prior to starting courses are less likely to drop, then you can design an orientation which students complete an online study timetable and include this as a check in the analytics. A course specific examples, if student success in a given course correlates with like using library resources, then the instructional designer working on that can incorporate activities that require the student to access and, develop facility with library resources. So this, of course, becomes not just a way to disaggregate the data and say, oh, this student is at risk, therefore, they're likely to drop, but rather, how do you drill down to something where you can actually measure what's going on with an individual, and based on that information, develop interventions that are going to support that individual in being successful. I love this one too. She talks about we need to distinguish between risk factors that are static and risk factors that are dynamic. What I love about this distinction is that risk factors that are dynamic mean those are opportunities where we have agency and we can create student agency as well. So static factors are those that don't change over time. That might be a student's background knowledge or country of origin, or something like that, ethnicity, gender, blah, blah, blah. Static factors are actually a much smaller subset than we tend to treat them. There are a lot of other factors that predict student success that are actually dynamic factors. And those are factors that can change quickly or change as a result of an intervention. In other words, would a student assessed on variable X actually still be considered at risk 6 months later or after an intervention is provided to them? And a really good example of this is online readiness. So I do a lot of work in online. People use online readiness all the time to focus on, is a student actually ready for online learning? That's a static, I'm sorry, that's a dynamic variable. That's not a static variable. You can change this for a student. So you can do a ton of things to help students develop self-regulation for online, be more prepared for that online learning environment. You can change that variable for them in online learning through designed interventions. And then she also talks about using individual behavior analytics in addition to group analytics. So how can we make data available to individual students as a form of learning support and self-assessment where they can actually use that? And instructional design can play a critical role here in designing systems or instructional features that are responsive to individuals. And she gives all kinds of examples. So again, what I really want you to notice here is that none of this is coming down and saying LA is bad or good. Keep or pitch, right? What she's saying is, if we're going to implement this, and this is the space I think most of us are in, administrators like, we're going to implement learning analytics. You as an ID don't really have much of a say in that. You may not have agency there, but here's all of the different ways in which a designer can enact agency by taking that and reframing the problem and then identifying, how do we maintain a sense of the individual? How do we give our students agency? And then how do we critically evaluate what are actually static, what's dynamic, what can change? How can I develop those interventions? And these are good examples of ways in which designers can really enact some of those ethics through design. So I'm actually going to skip over this in the interest of time. My apologies. Yeah, Danielle, thank you. Exactly. I'm glad that's exactly what I hope to get through to folks, is that there's just so much nuance here. The discourse is too often treated as very black or white. And even historically looking at technologies, that's just not how technologies tend to go. I mean, yeah, there's some technologies that we reject, and those branches just sort of die off. But more often than not, what's actually happening is a lot of social shaping of that process. Like that's, from my STS background, there's a lot of ways in which we as a society shape the technologies and bend things in the directions that we want them to go. So I'm going to skip over this activity, but I will highlight very quickly some examples of potential benefits, potential harms, and related ethical or legal principles for learning analytics. Again, it's all there in the slides. And apologies, in the interest of time, I'm going to scoot past that one too. Although I want to note, I did something different here. There's a dog. And there's some writing and a hammock. So I really want to get to professional ethics as design. And it's so funny. Danielle and I were talking about this last time. Chapter 6 in her book is like the essence of the book. And yet I feel like you've kind of got to go through all the rest of that to get to here. And this is part of the reason why metamodernism is such a great companion for this. So metamodernism is basically saying the critique is not enough. We have to translate that into action. I think that design is a fantastic companion to critical theory. So if we have critical theory as the critique, and then we have a theory of action as a companion to that, I think design is one of those great tools that we have in our tool set. It's not the only one, but it's the one that I'm obsessed with. So again, yes, the planet is dying, but maybe we can do something about it. Yes, there are inequities and injustices that happen as a result of ed tech designs and implementation, but there are things that we can do about it. So from this, I'm going to draw on Whitbeck's work. She's an engineer. She developed this idea of ethics as design. So again, just like rethinking ethics as reflection, a process of engaging in reflection, ethics as interrogation, a process of asking those critical questions. Now we have ethics as design as a sort to round out that set. So what does that mean? I think a lot of folks, when they hear ethics as design, they're like, what on earth does that mean? Whitbeck explains that, first of all, there are ethical and moral dimensions in the problems that we work on, period. It's extremely rare to be working on a problem that doesn't have some sort of ethical or moral dimension to it. So we work on these problems all the time. But she argues that ethics requires synthesis, not just analysis. Again, going back to this point that ethics are commonly treated as judgment or evaluation, but that's a really simplistic approach. She argues that ethical problems are really like design problems. We don't just choose a right answer. It's not like we go, well, my options are A, B, or C. And so I'm going to choose B for this reason. Usually when we're confronted with these problems, like, social justice, inequities, things like that, we have to devise solutions. It's that act of devising solutions that is design. So she says we need to stop thinking of ethics as judging and start treating them as design process and design specifications. So one tool that we've got in our tool set is ethical analysis. Just like what Scholes was doing and what I was showing you with learning analytics, we can use interrogation as a tool to map out both potential benefits and harms. And I want to note that folks tend to talk about harms as part of ethics, but it also includes goods or benefits. So how do we begin to treat those as design specs or requirements and brainstorm solutions that are better fits for maximizing benefits and minimizing harms? That's what you really saw embodied in Scholes. And so in some ways, I could have put that whole thing from Scholes under ethics as design as well. I feel like that's just such a good tangible example. So here we start to use design thinking and design process as a tool for translating our interrogation and reflection into application. So we identify the ethical issues or dimensions and then devise solutions. Now, we have a lot of work to do. McDonough is someone who works on environmental sustainability. If you, again, you're welcome to the links. This is a link, I'm pretty sure that the William McDonough blah blah links to the actual interview through this Stanford something or rather, where he's talking about this. He says it's no longer acceptable for us to say that it isn't part of our plan. Like here he's talking about negative impacts of power plants or pollution or things like that, because it's part of our de facto plan. These are the things that are happening because we have no other plan. And then we realize as a culture that we have become strategically tragic. Now, he's a designer talking to designers about how design has become strategically tragic, because we often think of design as this optimistic thing. But really, if you start to look at our designs, you start to wonder, how intentional were we? So he even asks questions about, like, if you were to retroactively design cars or something like that, would you design them the way that they are? Or would you look at something like that and say, boy, this is a truly tragic sort of design, like smokestacks? What a tragic design, right? So McDonough was really pushing us on this idea of how do we move from de facto plans? In other words, these things are happening because we didn't plan for it otherwise. We didn't have any alternative plan. So how does it become more part of our intentional design or intentional plan? Is EdTech inherently optimistic? A modernist perspective would say so, a postmodernist not. A meta-modernist would say we have a lot of work to do. So what is design? A couple of definitions here. It's a purposeful activity directed toward the goal of fulfilling human needs. It's very positive. It's an imaginative jump from present facts to future possibilities. It's concerned with how things ought to be. The designer devises a course of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. The entire activity from the stage of realization of a need to change to translating the image of the future system into reality. Design is a new way of resolving basic human conflicts, critical for securing safe passage to a desirable human future. So there's optimism that's inherent in design. You can almost start to say, boy, these are really modernist ideas, right? There's an inherent optimism in how we tend to think about design. And designers by nature do tend to be more optimistic individuals. But then when that's counterbalanced with the critique, right, we're starting to overlay that postmodernist critique to say, all right, we've got some things to do. But I love this idea from Percy Bysshe Shelley of moral imagination. He says the great instrument of moral good is the imagination. So part of this is envisioning and designing a range of possibilities, including both the potential to help as well as the potential to harm. And also, I love this definition from Drumwhite and Murphy, being able to see and think outside the box to envision moral alternatives. So when it comes to EdTech, how do we envision those moral alternatives and then build or implement or design in that direction? So I'm going to skip through this real quickly because I'm actually mainly just focused on craft. But these are 5 consciences for designers, and so I've got it in my notes here. Osgathorpe in 2003 identified these different consciences. I think craft is really the one that I like to focus on quite a bit. So I'm going to have us do a quick activity. And Christina or Rissa, if one of you could post a link for the Jamboard. What I want you to do is just brainstorm, and I've mentioned some tools that we can use as designers throughout. I want you to take just a few minutes to brainstorm what are some methods and strategies or tools that we can use to embed ethics in the design process. Thank you. Yes. All right. Let me pull this over. I see some folks in there. So I've mentioned some today. You might be using others as well that you want to share, or this might have even prompted some fresh ideas for you. So just take a moment in the Jamboard to post a sticky note about what are some tools that we can use. If you, yeah, perfect. For simulations, can you elaborate on what you mean by that? I'd love to hear more what you mean there. Yeah. I think there's a lot we can take from design thinking. So when I read simulations, I think of like failure analysis or case studies, but that may not be what the poster intended. Not yet, yes, but you can absolutely, Christina's got them, and you're also welcome to email me, and I'm more than happy to share these with you. Oh, yes, 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 yes. I like this about inspiring ideas. So again, one of my colleagues does something where she actually has designers imagine bad solutions. Like what would be really bad solutions that and it's a great way to get designers to unpack some of that. Yes, participatory and emancipatory design. So these are actual design models that folks have developed. Participatory design does have its grounding in ed tech, but emancipatory design comes from other fields. And these are actual tools that people are using to address some of what you're talking about. So participatory, of course, is making it more participatory. Emancipatory is sort of saying, what if I, as the designer, am not at the center of this universe? How do I center the actual end users? And that may mean I'm more of working on the side, or I'm just supporting their vision rather than trying to impose my vision. Wrong theory. That's it. Yes. That's what I was talking about wrong theory, like coming up with designs where it's like, how about if we start by applying the wrong theory to this? And then that starts to identify, okay, what do we want to avoid, or what's wrong about this? This is great. These are fantastic ideas. So I'm going to swap back over to mine and just share some of part of my tools and my tool set for ethics is design. So one thing that we commonly see designers do is ways they incorporate ethics into their practice is they will articulate an explicit design philosophy, either for themselves, or they will actually, as a team on a project, devote some time articulating a design philosophy for that project and discuss, what are some of these considerations or priorities that we want to bake in. So even just articulating either an individual or a team design philosophy for a project can be a really good tool. Of course, I've talked about ethical analysis, identifying benefits and harms, and mapping out some of the principles or some of the other considerations if you're coming from a different ethical perspective. But I think this idea of ethical analysis, in a lot of our models, we have all kinds of front-end analyses like learner analysis and environmental scan and blah, blah. I think we need to incorporate ethical analysis into that too. Developing a driving question. And then as part of that, engaging in problem framing. I tend to think of problem framing as a tool, as a strategy that we can use for intentionally framing these issues into the problem space that we're trying to work on, rather than framing them out or ignoring them altogether, rather than the de facto planning. Here's a yellow sticky note. Developing some explicit reflective questions that you can have on hand to remind yourself throughout. Certainly stakeholder involvement, that's come up sort of, I've treated that a little bit tangentially throughout this, but I feel like stakeholder involvement or participatory, emancipatory design are some of the best tools that we've got in our tool set for how we bring in those multiple voices. Oh, well, then, and participatory or emancipatory design are really good tools as well. I also included this, this just came out, Colin Gray and some colleagues who work more in human computer interactions on the HCI stuff. They just developed this lovely site. Yes, I'll be wrapping up. On ethics focused methods. So I wanted to embed that link in there too for you. I love how user-friendly the framing is around all of this. So this is a great resource for how designers can adopt ethics-focused methods as well. So with that, thank you all very much. This was really my first formal run through some of this. So thanks for your patience as I work out kinks and timing and stuff. Absolutely. My contact information is there. Feel free to email me at UNM. Christina has my slides. I'm always happy to connect and chat. So thank you for making the time for me today.